Lately, Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Ring segments. And if you're wondering why I'm talking from my living room with my trusty sidekick Kittalor by my side, it's because when I recorded this Dork Lord of the Ring segment 2 days ago, the intro mysteriously disappeared. So I'm re-recording it now. Alright, so today's topic is actually a continuation, part 2, of the topic of the tribes of men. That topic was suggested by commenter LP, aka Jesper. Thank you so much for that topic, Jesper. I really appreciate it. Last week, in part 1, I covered the Edain, the 3 tribes of men that went west, helped the elves win the War of Wrath against Morgoth. Today, part 2, we're going to talk about the tribes of men that did not go to the west in the First Age, of which there are many, and they all have a cool part to play in the history of Middle-earth. So, without further ado, part 2, I'm about to teleport to a new location and put on a sweater. So, thank you, Kittalor. I appreciate your able assistance. Take it away, 2 days old me. So, the first group we're going to talk about are those that were actually a part of the House of Halath, that second house of the Edain that went west. At some point, they stopped at the White Mountains. They had a temporary respite. They met up with this group called the Druidine, kind of the unofficial fourth house of the Edain. And eventually, the House of Halath kept migrating. I mentioned actually in the last episode, put a pin in this because this is important for later. Well, this is that later moment. So part of the house decided, we're done migrating, we're setting up shop. Good luck in your journeys west, because we're not going. And that group, in years to come, had a few different branches in Middle-earth. One of those branches would be the Men of Dunland, the Oathbreakers. They actually were right there in the White Mountains. And that's where they set up shop. That's the group that ignored Isildur's summons. They were cursed. That's the Paths of the Dead, where Aragorn eventually, reveals that he is of the line of Isildur, and he gives them a chance to honor their pledge and so free themselves from this cursed state. And so that's the Men of Dunland. They are tangentially connected to that House of Halath group, that tribe of men. Another offshoot of that House of Halath, that the folks that didn't keep migrating, are actually the folks who settled in Bree eventually. So in the Third Age, Bree, the Inn of the Prancing Pony, those folks have a lineage in connection with that House of Halath. But the most prolific group that is connected to those folks are the Dunlandings, the folks from Dunland. They eventually set up shop just to the west of Isengard. And they have a feud with Rohan, the Rohirrim. Basically feel like the Rohirrim took their lands. And there is a particular moment in the history between those two cultures that really has some bad blood. I've done a video on Helm Hammerhand. He was a king of Rohan about 250 years before the War of the Ring. He's the one for whom Helm's Deep is named. And there comes a point where there is a Lord of Rohan who lives basically in Dunland. And he is a leader of the hillmen of the Dunlandings. Claims to have a hereditary link to the kings of Rohan, but doesn't look the part. He's got dark hair. He's definitely a Dunlanding to all appearances, and everyone kind of assumes he is such. His name is Freka. But Freka tries to use this potential connection to the throne to have his son marry Helm's daughter. He tries to force that union.
and Helm's having none of it. They get in an argument, and Helm punches him to death. Actually, just one punch, apparently, but that's where Helm gets his name, Hammerhand, because he punches Freke to death. And the Dunlandings never forget that. I mean, justifiably so. They hate Helm Hammerhand, and they already didn't like Rohan to start with. This doesn't help them like Rohan anymore. Oh, their king just killed our leader with his bare hands. So flash forward 250 years to the War of the Ring, and at this point, Saruman is trying to, he's got his orcs, he's got his Uruk-hai, but he also recruits the Dunlandings. And the way he does it is he's like, look, your enemies, Rohan, I've got a big army, and we can go take it to your enemies. They readily agree. Now, one of the things, the movies show that, right? They show Saruman recruiting in the area around Isengard, and not just orcs, but also humans. But people can forget that in the Battle of Helm's Deep, it's not just orcs versus men. On the side of the orcs also were fighting Dunlandings. One side note, obviously in the movie Two Towers, the elves join the men of Rohan. That is not in the book. There is an elf. It's Legolas. There's one elf at the Battle of Helm's Deep. He obviously represents elfdom quite well, but Legolas is the only elf present at that battle in the book. But in any case, just to remember that there are men fighting alongside the orcs attacking Helm's Deep. And if you think about it, all right, so it's the Battle of Helm's Deep. It's named for Helm Hammerhand. There's a statue of Helm Hammerhand there, kind of readily seen in the courtyard. This is the guy who punched their leader to death 250 years ago. So it's like this physical manifestation of all that they hate about Rohan. It would be pretty easy, I think, to convince them, go and attack. And so the fight ends, and I'm going to read you actually a little passage from, this is post the Battle of Helm's Deep. And what's happening is the Dunlandings have surrendered, and they're terribly afraid because they've heard terrible things about what Rohan does to its prisoners. But here we go. I'm going to read it. Oh, by the way, I'm going to read you, there's a name, Erkenbrand. Erkenbrand is the name of one of the leaders of Rohan. After the war, he's actually named the Marshal of the Westmark, known for having this big red shield and a big black horn. Anyway, kind of a cool character from the books. Okay, anyway, here we go. No orcs remained alive. Their bodies were uncounted. But a great many of the hillmen had given themselves up, and they were afraid and cried for mercy. The men of the mark took their weapons from them and set them to work. Help now to repair the evil in which you have joined, said Erkenbrand, and afterwards you shall take an oath never again to pass the fords of Isen in arms, nor to march with the enemies of men. And then you shall go free back to your land. For you have been deluded by Saruman. Many of you have got death as the reward of your trust in him. But had you conquered, little better would your wages have been. The men of Dunland were amazed, for Saruman had told them that the men of Rohan were cruel and burned their captives alive. In the midst of the field before the Hornburg, 2 mounds were raised, and beneath them were laid all the riders of the mark who fell in the defense, those of the East Dales upon one side, and those of Westfold upon the other. But the men of Dunland were set apart in a mound below the dike. So there we see that the men of Rohan are showing mercy on their enemies, burying their dead, not burning them alive. Yay for that. We can see there that this cultural enmity between those two factions kind of came to a head right there at the Battle of Helm's Deep. And Rohan was at least able to partially forgive in this moment and show some measure of compassion. So since we just talked about the Rohirrim and the compassion they showed, why don't we talk about the Northmen? Now, the Northmen did not journey west in the First Age with the Edain, but they also managed to avoid the temptation of falling under Morgoth's thrall. And so after the War of Wrath, they were joined by the Edain who did not want to travel to Numenor, to the new island that they'd been promised. Some of those folks stayed, and they mingled with the Northmen. And so pockets of the Northmen included the Men of Dale, Bard of Dale and that group. There were the Woodmen of Mirkwood. There's a group that hung out in Mirkwood. And the Eothed. That group is what eventually became the Rohirrim and was granted the area of Rohan. Another interesting offshoot of the Northmen would be the Beornings. So after the Battle of Five Armies, the war that ended the Hobbit, the orcs were decimated, and a lot of Northmen rallied around kind of one of the heroes of that battle, Beorn, the skin changer who could turn into a bear. And so this large group of Northmen became the Beornings. And their chief was Beorn, and I believe Beorn's son. Just so you know, it wasn't all Beornings couldn't skin change. It wasn't like, I've joined up with Beorn, now I could turn into a bear at will. I think it was just Beorn's kin that could actually do the skin changing. But his followers, Northmen followers, were called Beornings. So that's just a brief overview of the Northmen. Another group that would be in the non-Edain group would be Hobbits. Hobbits are not actually a race unto themselves. They are a subclass of humans. We don't really see them until about the Third Age, so they probably weren't in this part of the awakening of men originally, and probably never had the issue of, do we follow Morgoth or not? But somewhere in the Third Age, we start seeing the Stoors, who are a group of hobbits that settle in the Gladden Fields area near the Anduin River. That's Sméagol's folk. And obviously we have hobbits in the Shire. But yeah, so there's count them as a group, a subgroup of humanity. Another group of note would be actually the Black Numenoreans. Now, obviously, being Numenoreans, they were part of the Edain originally, but with this particular group, they reflected this division that I've talked about in other videos on Numenor, where you had the Kingsmen versus the Faithful. Essentially, the Faithful were faithful to the Valar. They thought they were a group to be obeyed and respected. The Kingsmen thought that the Valar had no right to make demands on them and were no better than Numenor. And so, there was this big division between Kingsmen and Faithful. Eventually, when Numenor sinks, it's the Kingsmen that were, led by Ar-Pharazôn that went and tried to attack the Valar. And it's Elendil and his group, they are of the Faithful that successfully settle in Middle-earth. Well, after the fall of Numenor, there are still some other folks on Middle-earth who are Numenorean that are not the Faithful. There were some Kingsmen that had settled in Middle-earth before the fall of Numenor. And those Kingsmen became eventually known as Black Numenoreans. And since they had always feuded against the Faithful, they continued to feud against the Faithful. And since Gondor was ruled by Elendil and his kin, you had a situation where the Black Numenoreans were at odds with Gondor, kind of from the get-go. Generally the Faithful set up a harbor at Pelargir, and it was the Black Numenoreans that set up their harbor at the havens of Umbar. And if Umbar sounds familiar, it's because that's the corsairs of Umbar are supposedly going to come and help win the war against Gondor, but it's Aragorn has turned the tables and thwarts that effort. Aragorn actually crossed paths with Umbar about 40 years earlier as well. At the time, he was fighting for Gondor under an assumed name, Thorongil. The steward of Gondor, Ecthelion II, sent him on a night raid, and Aragorn's company burned most of Umbar's fleet, and he slew the captain of the haven in a melee on the docks before escaping with most of his men. So, Umbar never had much luck against Aragorn, son of Arathorn. Just to the east of Umbar lives another tribe of men that did not go to the west in the First Age. This was the Haradrim. They were all in on Morgoth back in the First Age. So they were followers. Back by the time of the Third Age, they are against Gondor. They are in the armies of Sauron, and they're the ones that ride the Mumakil, the giant elephants, into battle with that really cool-looking scene from the Return of the King movie. And that leaves the Easterlings. So this group had a lot to say about the history of Middle-earth. Right, they did not go to the west, hence the name Easterlings. They definitely bought in on Morgoth. And in the First Age, they play a massive part in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. So in this situation, this is after the Siege of Angband has been broken. And Morgoth has killed a bunch of folks. The elves rally, and they decide they're going to take it to Morgoth in this big battle. They've actually got the Edain on their side, so these houses of men have joined in the fight. And they're ready to go. Problem is, the elves also take in some of the Easterlings. And these Easterlings are spies. They are working on behalf of Morgoth. And I find it really interesting the way that Tolkien shows this betrayal through the eyes of two different families of Easterlings. So there's the family headed by Ulfang and the family headed by Bor. Bor's family of Easterlings are farmers, essentially. They are from like a little bit of a different sub-tribe to Ulfang. Ulfang is kind of with a group of hunter-gatherers. All right, so Morgoth co-opts both of these families to go pretend to join the elves so they can betray them. As it turns out, Bor and his family, and when the moment comes, they decide they are not going to betray the elves, so they actually go against Morgoth. Ulfang, basically, you could arguably say he is what costs the elves the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. He does two things that are pretty devious. One, he gives false reconnaissance information to the elves. And so their battle plan is based on completely wrong information. Specifically, he's working with Maglor, one of the sons of Fëanor. So after feeding them bad information, there comes a point in the battle when the Easterlings turn and attack the elves. So not only do they give them bad info to start with, they also attack them on the battlefield. And so I'm going to read you this little portion here that describes what happens during the Battle of Unnumbered Tears when the Easterlings betray the elves. Yet neither by wolf, nor by Balrog, nor by dragon would Morgoth have achieved his end, but for the treachery of men. In this hour, the plots of Ulfang were revealed. The sons of Ulfang went over suddenly to Morgoth and drove in upon the rear of the sons of Fëanor, and in the confusion that they wrought, they came near to the standard of Maethros. They reaped not the reward that Morgoth promised them, For Maglor slew Uldor the Accursed, the leader in treason. And the sons of Bor slew Ulfast and Ulvarth, ere they themselves were slain. But new strength of evil men came up that Uldor had summoned, and kept hidden in the eastern hills. And the host of Maethros was assailed now on 3 sides, and it broke and was scattered, and fled this way and that. Yet fate saved the sons of Feanor, and though all were wounded, none were slain, for they drew together, and gathering a remnant of the Noldor and the Naugrim about them, they hewed a way out of the battle, and escaped far away towards Mount Dolmed in the east. All right, so I threw a few names in there at you. Those were the sons of both Bor and Ulfang. I think it's interesting that both of them have 3 sons. Bor has 3 sons. Ulfang has 3 sons. There's a symmetry to these families who die violently in this battle. Interestingly, it doesn't say that Ulfang himself perished in this fight. We don't know the fate of Ulfang, but it keeps mentioning Uldor the Accursed, which is one of Ulfang's sons. It mentions Uldor the Accursed, the leader in treason. So it makes it seem like perhaps Ulfang maybe was too elderly to fight in this moment, and so left it to his sons to fight. So let's say it's Uldor who in the moment leads this terrible betrayal, but it's Maglor who kills Uldor on the field of battle. It's the sons of Bor who kill the other sons of Ulfang, and then they themselves are killed off. Bor is killed. There's a whole lot of Easterlings dying, and elves as well, unfortunately. The battle goes horribly for the elves as a result of this terrible betrayal by Ulfang and his family from the Easterlings. So after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, obviously the good guys rally and win the War of Wrath to end the First Age, send Morgoth off into the void. But Sauron kind of extends the influence with those Easterlings and uses them to evil effect for many, many years after. And for thousands of years in the Third Age, they are enemies of Gondor. You've got different, as I mentioned, with Ulfang and Bor being 2 different subclasses of Easterling. Such you have in the Third Age as well. You've got the Wain Riders, the Balchoth, the Khand. In fact, there's mention of the Khand is fighting at the Battle of Pelennor Fields. They fight on behalf of Sauron's armies. It mentions in the book Variags from Khand, or something like that. The term Variag is an Old Norse term which means mercenary. So some people have theorized that perhaps these were mercenaries hired by Khand to fight in this war, on behalf of Sauron. I think maybe it's just as easy to say they were mercenaries from Khand that Sauron brought in to fight in the Pelennor Fields. Either way, Khand itself was a bitter enemy of Gondor. So whether it's Dunlandings or Northmen or Haradrim or Hobbits or Easterlings, there were actually quite a few tribes of men that did not journey to the west in that First Age and still had a lot to say about the history of Middle-earth. So there you go, everybody. The tribes of men. Thanks so much. If you've got a topic you'd like me to talk about, feel free to put it in the comments. Be happy to do a video about a topic of your choosing. And with that, I say goodbye, everybody. Thanks.